you very much. I want to thank Elizabeth Werby for putting together such an excellent program and inviting me to participate. When she first wrote to me in the spring about this program and described the questions, I thought, well, I would like to go anyway, so I agreed to be the moderator. The questions before us tonight, I think, are among the most important in global science and policy. And I would frame it just quickly this way, as Liz already has so effectively, is how much do we need to know from a scientific perspective in order to act from the perspective of the state or a society or a people? And this is a very complicated question. It's come up in my own work in the history of medicine repeatedly over the years. How much do we have to know about the human immunodeficiency virus and blood to begin to take measures to attempt to protect the blood supply, even when we can't know that it is a virus and we don't know precisely how it's communicated? It was a crucial issue in the 1980s. This past week, I was teaching in a graduate seminar, and we were reading a book about John Snow and the 1854 epidemic of cholera. Snow was convinced that cholera was in the water. There were no ways of seeing the cholera vibrio under a microscope in 1854, but through the types of knowledge that he had constructed by doing what we would call shoe leather epidemiology, he concluded that it was crucial to take the handle off the Broad Street pump to stop the epidemic. There was much that he knew, but there was a great deal, there was a tremendous amount that he could not possibly know. And as a society, as a global society, we're confronted by many of these questions where science has gone far, but will never completely resolve certain questions, and how are we to think about them from the point of view of our polity, our politics, and our policy. What happens when there's a great deal of scientific consensus, but there are remaining skeptics? One of the things I found in my work on tobacco smoking is that the tobacco industry could always identify a prominent, even a respected scientist who was willing to say that he was skeptical and that there was no proof that smoking caused lung cancer, long beyond a phase in which almost all of medical science understood that smoking was a powerful risk for lung cancer and other diseases. So this is really the question before us, and it confronts us in many different ways around toxins, around the environment, around pharmaceuticals. Are the drugs that we take safe, and how do we know that they're safe, and with what confidence? And so in a very great way, the Museum of Natural History here has assembled an exceptionally talented panel who I think will bring different perspectives to this particular issue, which is of such importance to how we conduct ourselves around science, policy, and the welfare of our publics. So let me quickly introduce the panel and turn it over to them. The first speaker will be Professor James McCarthy. Professor McCarthy is the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Biological Oceanography, and for 2 decades served as director of Harvard University's Museum of Comparative Zoology. He holds faculty appointments in our Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology and the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, and he's the head tutor for degrees in environmental science and public policy. He's won many awards and served on many public scientific panels and boards. His own research has centered on issues relating to the regulation of plankton productivity in the sea. He's worked on issues of seasonal and interannual variation in climate. And it's really a great pleasure for me to welcome Jim McCarthy here tonight. The second speaker will be Professor Sheila Jasanoff, who's the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She has taught at Cornell, Yale, Oxford, and Kyoto. At Cornell, she was the founder and chairman of the Department of Science and Technology Studies. She's held many distinguished visiting professorships and research appointments. She's written extensively on the questions at the center of our discussion today, and as the Dean of the Graduate School, I'm pleased to announce she'll be the first director of our important secondary field for graduate students in science, technology, and society. So it's a pleasure to have you here on the panel. Our third speaker will be Bruce Gellerman, who many of you know from National Public Radio. He's a producer at Living on Earth, and he's the winner of 40 national awards for environmental, financial, investigative, scientific, and social affairs reporting. He's won many awards, and he's written extensively about questions of science and the public interest. And I think he'll bring a very important perspective to our discussion tonight. So let me begin with Professor McCarthy.
Thank you. Thank you, Allan, and welcome everyone. It's terrific to look out and see a number of friends in the audience this evening. I hope you're all friends, but certainly some old friends, and people with whom I've had many senses a sustained discussion over several years on the topic that we have before us this evening. And like Allan, I really hope to learn from this discussion. I think we're going to learn from each other, but I think we're going to learn from you as well. So I also was eager to come this evening for exactly that reason. Allan gave a great example of how with the story of tobacco use in this country and the realization that it was a human health hazard, it was extraordinarily difficult to put into place any sort of guidelines or ultimately restrictions on the use of that product. And it's interesting, even with the weight of all the professional societies, and we have a similar situation today with regard to climate science, and the topic, or rather part of the heading this evening, Persuasion in the Climate of Uncertainty. Climate of uncertainty is a sort of a metaphor for so many aspects of what we've been dealing with from the climate science perspective. So when you have every National Academy of Sciences in the world that has spoken on this topic, when you have all the professional societies of climatologists, meteorologists, oceanographers, ecologists that have put out statements, and in the United States there are about 20 of those professional societies put out statements, which are all consistent, national academies, professional societies saying climate is changing in unusual ways. It's changing in ways that are only consistent with human activities forcing climate. If we continue along this trajectory, there will be serious climate impacts. If we didn't have 7 billion people on the planet, highly dependent upon ecosystem services, highly dependent upon socioeconomic systems that support us in all aspects of our lives, our supplies of food, our supplies of fuel, our where we live, what we do, it wouldn't be a problem, but it is a problem. And particularly with a disproportionate fraction of the nearly 7 billion people living very near coastlines with sea level rising. So the questions are really interesting when you deal with a skeptical public on this subject. Well, it's unlikely to really happen in a dramatic way in my lifetime. Should I really make changes that would, in some small way perhaps, maybe collectively with enough people doing it, alter the likelihood of serious impacts? What are the chances that I would go to that trouble and find that I had to spend something and there was really no return? How confident are we that these impacts will unfold? One of the interesting things about projecting climate, and you can't really predict climate, you just project it, is that a good fraction of the uncertainty about future climate is not how climate will work, but it's what people will do. So by 2050, how many of us will there be? There are some pretty good projections for that. What will the standard of living be? Developing world, because that says something about how much consumption we'll have, and that says something about how we use natural resources. And then critically, what fraction of that consumption will be fueled by fossil fuels? Because science is quite consistent that it's the fossil fuel-driven part of this that is changing climate most radically. And when you see the changes that unfold with any of these sort of mid-range projections looking like anywhere from 100 to 1,000 times faster than climate has changed any time in the last several thousand years since humans have been developing their population, their societies on this planet, you realize there's a collision course here. So what is the persuasion problem? It's not the scientific community doesn't get it. Is it the public? Are they doubtful of the science? Are they doubtful of this science in particular? Is it the enormous corporate influence, the same influence that Allan was talking about from the tobacco industry coming from the vested interests in oil and gas, the fossil fuel lobbies, coal, that are keeping our decision makers from listening to their constituents? Are there really questions that have arisen recently, let's say within the last 2 or 3 years, about climate science that cause people to question whether the science is even as robust or valid as climate scientists have been insisting? So I hope we'll have a chance to explore some of those topics as we move into the discussion this evening, and I look forward to your questions and this full discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Sheila Jasanoff.
Thank you, Allan, and thank you, Liz Werby, for putting the panel together. And I'd like to second what Dean Brandt and Professor McCarthy have said about how the interaction is the main thing that we're all going to take away from tonight's session. So I just want to sharpen those interactions. I want to approach the problem before us from a slightly different angle, maybe stressing the persuasion dimension a bit more than the uncertainty dimension. So it's worth stepping back a little bit in time and to remind ourselves that we brought the problem of uncertainty upon ourselves. There was a time not that long ago when we made a lot of decisions, particularly political and legal decisions about science and technology writ large, without any uncertainty, because we insisted that things should be certain before we would act. I'm a lawyer by training. We live in a common law country. So up through the 1950s, common law courts didn't want to act unless they saw evidence that persuaded them that things were pretty certain. If harm was going to occur, they never wanted to stop that harm until it reached a standard that they called imminence. So when the harm was imminent, only then would a court step in and say, don't do this thing anymore. And imminent meant lots of green goop running through your river and visible to everybody. And even then, if you couldn't show it was toxic because animals were dying off, courts would not move to act. So in that sense, until the middle of the previous century, we were societies that were committed to certainty big time, and we didn't want to act in the face of uncertainty. So what happened? Well, one of the things that happened that's familiar to anybody who knows about environmental history is 1962, Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. So we became aware gradually, and really the middle of the 20th century is a kind of watershed time for this, that environmental phenomena of a very negative sort can creep up on us, and unless we act in advance, we're going to suffer consequences that we can't live with. So it was a decision, a societal, cultural decision that we now needed to be proactive, that we needed to act in the face of uncertainty. And we've got much better at it. So I like a moment in time when a former colleague of mine from Cornell was president of the Ecological Society of America, and he exhorted his fellow ecologists to drop this common law idea of waiting for imminence and to get much more involved in policy making by trying to predict. I mean, so these are moments that historians of science can actually trace in the record, times when scientists became interested in looking into the domain that we call uncertainty and being able to put limits around it and being able to make believable statements about the stuff that is uncertain. So it became a shifting scientific era in which science moved from being pretty observational, pretty close to the ground, pretty interested in saying this is how it is, and became more interested in saying this is how it will be. So genetics is a very good example of that. Many of us understand intuitively or technically terms like genetic risk and genetic susceptibility, but what does that mean? It means that we've learned to see things that may or may not happen in the future. This is why it's a risk. This is why it's only susceptibility. We know that people have certain genetic traits and certain markers. We know that plants do, we know that ecosystems do, but we can't quite predict exactly how those markers are going to play out in the individual case or even across populations. So in a way, we've become very good at seeing new things, but we've opened up vast worlds in which we're trying to predict all kinds of things where we have very poor handles around the phenomena that we're trying to grasp way out in the future. When the US was considering burying the nation's high-level radioactive wastes under Yucca Mountain, this highly contested site, Sandia National Laboratories commissioned from linguistics departments around the country a study about where language was going to be 10,000 years hence, because they were under a mandate to ensure that the radioactive waste would not leak out of this site 10,000 years hence. And as Jim has already mentioned, we want to know about human behavior then. So what language could we frame our warnings in right now so that 10,000 years from now we would know that people would still understand those phenomena? Well, I mean, we don't even have 10,000 years of recorded history. I mean, I like to say that take Stonehenge, about 5,000 years old. We haven't a clue what Stonehenge was built for. So that gives us a little bit of a sense. The only political system that has arguably lasted approximately 1,000 years is Britain's. And if you know anything about English history, you know how many upheavals it's gone through. At least one king lost his head in the process. So, I mean, you know, we're not very well able to predict on these kinds of timescales. Another sort of price of knowing too much is that we also aggregate on scales that we never used to be able to aggregate on before. We have extremely powerful computers. We can calculate risks on the basis of huge populations. And that means that we can pick up signals that are actually quite small. And this has led to something that you might think of as the tyranny of small numbers. We can detect the potential for, you know, 1 in a million probabilities that cancer risk will be increased in a population through exposure to toxic substances. But of course, with those tiny signals, you don't know which person is going to be the person affected. And yet we're egalitarian societies. We like to think that if we have a very powerful drug and it's going to benefit 99 people or 999 people, then the one person who's badly affected, who suffers the adverse consequences, should be compensated somehow for the fact that society benefits and that person got hurt. But those are tiny probabilities of harm, and it's very difficult to show in the individual case that that person actually suffered. So I think we have to deal with the fact that with our egalitarian and humanitarian instincts, we're often trying to remedy harms where it's extremely difficult to show what exactly the causal pathway was that led us to that point. So while this sort of price of knowledge has grown, that we know so much that we've opened up yet vaster areas of ignorance, and yet we also feel the need to control those areas of ignorance in some sense, that's where the need for persuasion has grown. We are more and more dependent on having trustworthy messengers who can tell us, you know, what the risks are that we really ought to care about, when and to what extent. How much should we pay for prevention? Jim McCarthy has been president of the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science. A very high official, I won't say who or how high, in that organization once told me that he was not sure whether he was a climate skeptic or a climate believer. Why? Because his training was not in climate science, and he actually didn't know who to trust when he read about climate science, because that was not his domain of specialty. So that's a reminder that, in a sense, all of us, no matter how technically literate we are are actually quite ignorant when it comes to a huge swath of the kinds of ranges of evidence that we have to believe in or act on the basis of. So we're in a society where Allan Brandt said that the question is, how much do we have to know before we can act? I think a lot of the parallel question is, whose knowledge are we going to trust? We're in a society where we are doomed to trusting the wisdom of strangers for the most part, and how we get our hands and our ethical minds wrapped around trust in strangers is a huge problem for us to confront. So I'll end there and hand it over to Bruce.
Thank you very much.
So I guess I'm one of the messengers that Professor Jasanoff was just talking about. You know, I find myself on this distinguished panel, and it's a little unusual for me because, with apologies to Professor McCarthy, as plankton journalists are usually seen as the lowest form of life. And but you're probably reminded. I'm reminded of that commercial that had a man that said, you know, I'm not a doctor, I play one on TV. Well, I'm not a scientist, I play one on radio for many people, because that's basically my job. I'm the connector between scientists and the public. That's my role. So let me give you a little idea of some of the things that I worked on just today, and it'll give you a sense that I really don't know what I'm talking about most of the time. So I started off with a conference call to Tianjin, China, where they're having the UNFCCC, the Sea Climate Conference is starting next week. That was with the NRDC, and to find out what was going on there. And then I spoke to the winner of the McCarthy Awards, who studies honeybees. And then I spoke with someone about the Gulf restoration, because they announced today this new report that came out about all the hundreds and tens of billions of dollars that will be spent trying to restore the Gulf of Mexico following the BP disaster. And then I spoke to someone about goats on a roof, a restaurateur who has these goats on his roof. Something about uranium. We did a piece about Captain Planet, which I never even heard of, and now I find out he's been around for 20 years. And then I started work on a project that I dropped off a few weeks ago about offshore wind, and that'll be coming up in about 2 weeks if my editor has her way. But the point that I'd like to make is that I'm not a scientist, and what I am is a person who understands the language of science. I am a translator. I am an interpreter. I take what they say, I put it into a context, and then tell a story about it. It's a once upon a time. That's what I do. And I make it understandable, I make it honest, I make it accurate. I don't make it balanced, and that's a whole nother issue for a whole nother discussion. But that's what I do. And in that are the skills, I think, of a reporter or a journalist, knowing what's important, prioritizing it, figuring out what the context is, where it fits in, who needs to know, who to talk to about that story. All these are journalistic judgments which me and the editors and the producers and all the rest of the staff work on. I don't like politics. I left Washington after about 6 years working at NPR because I never understood the place. I loved going to Congress, I loved going to the hearings, and I loved listening to the scientists because they got people from all over the world. And they got to sit there, and these senators and congressmen would come in and out and not know what they were talking about, but I got a great education. But then, 6 or 8 months later, or a year later, I'd hear these reports that had nothing to do about the science. The policy was incredible. I wondered if they were in the same room with me. So what goes into a process is not oftentimes what comes out at the other end. It's, you've heard of sausage. But I have come to appreciate now the role of public policy, how critical, how important the role of politics and persuasion is, as opposed to the facts. You got the facts, and then you got the psychology or the persuasion. And they're much different things. And I wrestle with that now mightily, and we can talk a little bit perhaps about Cape Wind and how you have facts on both sides and public policy that's pushing this ahead. So my role is as interpreter, as messenger, and you can blame me.
Great. Well, let me start out by asking a question, then we'll throw it open. But in a way, you know, listening to Bruce talking about his role as a journalist seems to me to be one of the crucial elements in the entire problem that we're addressing, because on the one hand, there's a scientific community that mostly talks to one another using an esoteric language, and on the other hand, what they're producing in terms of knowledge is critically important to the public. So how does it transfer from that scientific community and that way of thinking and talking to the public in ways that will be important for the polity and for policy? So Bruce Gellerman plays a crucial role, as do journalists. And my question really would be this. When you're thinking about how to portray this, one of the things that comes out in Sheila Jasanoff's comments is that we often have very big concerns about very small risks, and sometimes we have very small concerns about very big risks. And so what is the journalist, what is the translator's role in trying to convey to the public what risk they should really be considering in the most serious way?
Whoa. Okay, well, let me try to answer it a little bit this way, and I won't go at length. First of all, scientists have become much better, generally, at communicating their expertise to a reporter. They're more familiar with getting calls from reporters. They're more familiar with just being prepped by their PR people. So, you know, for example, the Professor Spivak, that was the bee expert, I could tell she spent her whole life dealing with bees, and probably hadn't spoken outside anyone else, really outside of her field, for, you know, quite a while about this material. But she had been prepped. She had been prepped by McCarthy people. She had been prepped by the University of Minnesota. She was ready for me, and she gave her short, concise, good answers. In terms of figuring out, prioritizing what's important, what is not, let me draw on an example. What I'm looking for in a story are patterns. Okay, what are the patterns? So I spend a lot of time researching and a lot of time over a long period of time understanding different areas. And when I see something disturbing, that's what gets my attention. I didn't care about Cape Wind, for example, until they announced the price was going to be twice as much for the energy than had been anticipated, than conventional energy, which was at the end of this process. The thing had gone on 10 years. I only got interested when I heard that it was going to be so expensive. So I'm looking for that little nugget, that thing that pops up and says, I'm different. In terms of prioritizing the reporting around you know, what's significant, what's not. Enormously complex question. We are in a news cycle that is not counted in days, minutes, hours, it's minutes and seconds. So you have very little, you know, superlatives go a long way. It's the first, it's the biggest, it's the last, it's the only, it's the most dangerous. So a reporter's always looking for these kind of superlatives to hang their peg on this story. And they have to trust their instincts and the scientists they talk to. So what you do as a reporter, and there's a little bit roundabout answer, is you try to bisect where those unusual points come to. That is, what am I hearing? Where are the patterns collating? That's where I focus my attention. Okay. Prioritizing, I got all kinds of priorities. You know, it's got to fit into the show. I couldn't have done it last week, because that'd be redundant. I didn't have, so there's all kinds of priorities that go into a story being presented. Hope that helps you.
Great. Questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Well, I have one. I'm a chemist and also a Harvard MBA and also a climate activist. And I think about this problem constantly for years and what's wrong with this situation, because when you listen to the scientists, we're headed for big trouble. And when you talk to the people on the street, it's just another day. And I keep saying this can't be happening. So I ask myself, what's wrong? And the thing I've come to, it relates to what Professor Jasanoff said to some degree. I think that our whole systems of deciding have not evolved in a way to deal with something that is so complex and so much in the future. And it's so frustrating as a scientist that we can't get the word to the people. In a democracy, you can't get the government to do anything unless the people are informed. So how do we break the logjam and solve the problem? That's my question.
I'll reframe that. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear. But the question really is, what about these instances in which there is a good deal of important scientific consensus and a good deal of public misunderstanding or lack of concern about the problem, because in the end, the public will drive, to some degree, the political process around these questions. So let me open it up to the panel.
Well, the public,
Sheila.
well, please.
Well, yeah, so one of the things I'd suggest is look around us. So not everybody experiences the climate problem in the same way. In fact, climate skepticism, sort of like evolution skepticism, is kind of localized in the United States of America. I mean, you know, even Canada behaves differently. So I think that prompts us to ask things about our democracy, our political system. And of course, you get stuck a little bit because you find that the pathologies are the flip side of the good things. I mean, we're highly individualistic. We like making our own choices. We don't like being told, even by scientists, you know, what to think and believe. But we do know that there are some kinds of institutional structures that promote agreement better than others. And I think one of the mistakes that we've made historically is to act as if science is apart from politics and values, that the facts and the values can be kept apart. On the whole, if you look around the world, the places where the consensus around climate science is pretty high, like, say, Germany, also map onto places where the institutional structures have made an effort to combine expertise with politics. So just one example from the German case, that they go about doing their technical assessments of these big global problems by appointing experts through a parliamentary process. So the parties actually select their experts, and then everybody's forced to come into the room and talk together. Now, I mean, I'm too much myself of a social skeptic to say that any answer is the ideal and right one, but nevertheless, I think that the strengths and weaknesses of the German system are a bit different from ours, and the pathological skepticism, the extreme skepticism, and people being able to buy an opinion and thereby sort of spawn this skepticism, that is kept under greater control in most other countries. The other very quick answer I would give is that one can talk about policy in a less all or nothing way and recognize that policy itself can be made to look experimental, in a sense actually more like science, by giving quicker feedbacks and allowing for corrections. I think people get scared when they think it's binary and it's all or nothing, and you've got to do this, and otherwise you sink. So going back to my Yucca Mountain case, which was this incredibly protracted controversy in the United States, it's interesting to compare with the French approach to solving, quote unquote, the radioactive waste problem. They've recently decided that whatever they do with it, it has to be reversible. I mean, you know, it's one single word, and what it actually means in engineering terms still needs to be figured out. But the fact is that the French public has joined forces around this. There's consensus. Why? Because it means experimental solutions, ones that you can turn around and go back on. So I think that that's that kind of example from the policy domain, not from the scientific domain, where other people confronting the same problems are actually coming up with answers that to some extent help us thinking about end runs. That I think those comparisons are really important to look at.
Jim.
It's a great question, and there are a number of ways of thinking about it, and I'm sure you've explored many of these. One of the really curious things to me is how the particular issue that you mentioned, the the robustness of climate science, why does it not lead to policy that reflects what most scientists would say are sort of realistic concerns about the future? And if you look over the last 20 years, when this has become an issue that is discussed now by heads of state, by elected officials, that really, in 1990, this was not something that, you get an occasional hearing, but it's only in 1989 that heads of state start talking to each other about it. And over the last sort of handful of years, this issue has become sort of shockingly politicized in the United States. If you go back to 2001, 2002, after the 2000 election, presidential election, the person in the U.S. Senate who was most engaged on the topic of climate change was Senator John McCain. He held a number of hearings. He got really informed. He was a remarkably powerful champion of understanding the science among his Senate colleagues. McCain-Lieberman was the first proposed action in the U.S. Congress, House or Senate, to do something serious about it. It got 40-some votes or so and died. Brought it back again. McCain-Lieberman 2 got another, few more votes, still didn't get 50. In the 2008, the primaries leading up to 2008 election, the major candidates, except for, I'd say, one in both parties, and on the Republican side, you have McCain and have Huckabee, were saying, as well as Clinton, Obama, Edwards, that we must reduce fossil fuel emissions, we must get on a trajectory, take us down 60, 70, 80, or 90%, that was kind of the range, by 2050. So if you look at Germany, you look at England, the action that is in the wind is without a strong political. In fact, you'll find conservative politicians thinking that we need to conserve the climate, we need to conserve the earth, we need to conserve resources. This is all very consistent, and yet in this country it's become, just in a handful of years, increasingly, and in the last couple of years, intensely politicized. And so it's a very, I think, startling transformation in which you cannot yet, now that Mr. McCain isn't prepared to support anything he's heard in Senate proposals these days. Lindsey Graham, for a while, was working with Democrats. Now, of course, he parted company on the Kerry-Lieberman bill. So we've reached this stalemate that is, in what should have been an era of potentially significant national decision-making. And of course, as you know, for some people, an obstacle to all of this is that in order to do what has to be done, it's not each of us doing something individually, it's not just cities, it's not just states, and that's where the action is really. It's our federal government. And for people who don't think that's the role of the federal government, it's easy for them to say, no, we're just not going there. So I think, what we have a lot to learn from the sort of work that Sheila and her colleagues are doing in this area, because science alone could not, I think, get us any closer to where we need to be. It's the persuasive side of that, which is the social science side of that, that missing. And just a final comment on some of the things Bruce was saying. He gave us a great example for why we need to support National Public Radio, because it's one of the few places you can get this kind of science coverage these days. You can't get it from very few newspapers anymore. And the realization that there are not a lot of people in the world of press anymore who are really skilled in talking with scientists. They want the soundbite, they don't want any more, they don't want to be confused by the facts, and give it to me quickly because I'm moving on to another story. So part of the problem is also it's hard to get really good information from the media these days, and the blogs are just a morass of confusing garbage.
So I would suggest that, climate skepticism does occur in a larger social context, and it's a phenomenon which actually has been going on for a long time. We've seen tremendous examples of it in the last administration, where science was demeaned and made people were skeptical of the science at the highest levels of government. But it's also a part of a phenomenon of, science education, and the fact that our science literacy is not as high as we would hope and want. Things like Climate Gate, when they disclosed the memos, that was very well timed, extraordinary. Whoever planned this out and come out was a master of manipulation, as opposed to persuasion, I suppose, if that's the other side of the coin, of the public's attention. They were able to take science. Science is not perfect, of course, and consensus doesn't mean we all agree to everything, and it doesn't mean that we don't have personalities that are involved in it, and that we don't have disagreements. But they were able to take that stuff and leverage it extraordinarily well just before the Copenhagen COP15 started in December last year. So what I would suggest, though, is going to happen is this with climate skepticism. The conversation, the framework for climate is going to change. Everyone gets weather. Nobody gets climate. You got to be a climate paleontologist or something. It's complicated stuff. But you get the weather. I understand when it's hot as hell in Moscow and and there are floods in Bangladesh and Pakistan. I get it. So you'll see a lot more of that kind of blurring of the distinctions, so people get it. But I would suggest this is what's going to happen. You can kind of test this out in the next few weeks. That the conversation around climate change, around this UN climate meeting, is not going to be about climate. That's done, right? The IPCC, the scientists came out with the reports. They came up with the Kyoto Protocol. Everybody knows, they have the accord for the voluntary targets. The conversation is going to be around security, national security and energy security. That's where it's going to change. Skepticism be damned.
Yes, in the back.
I'm grateful Bruce Gellerman brought up the point of manipulation, because that other phrase that the title of this talk uses a bit benign, persuasion, is just one part of this. The other one is manipulation and propaganda. There have been very good studies, a recent book called Merchants of Doubt by a historian of science,
Sure.
and the well-known study by the Union of Concerned Scientists that have shown that there's a great deal of well-financed manipulation of public opinion happening. And sometimes people in the academic sphere are a bit too naive to notice that this thing is going on and that it's massive and that it has the potential to change people's opinion, and that has been quantified as well.
Just so that everybody could hear, the question centered on the issue of vested industrial interests who shape the character of these debates and how they do it. And so when there is climate skepticism, or skepticism, as I indicated, about the tobacco relationship to disease, the question is, what is the role of very powerful economic interests in shaping these debates?
Well,
Jim.
Allan started this by talking about tobacco and the fact that an industry with a lot of interest in any sort of regulations that might affect their bottom line has enormous power to fight back. And your example is an excellent one of the oil and gas industry, and what in Merchants of Doubt, what Naomi Oreskes does is to trace the morphing of that strategy from tobacco, including some of the very same individuals who were hired to fight the science relating to secondhand smoke, were then hired to produce either sleight of hand, or in some cases outright bogus reports saying there's nothing to worry about with climate change. You look at today, what's happening literally today in California with the very progressive measures introduced by a Republican governor that put California ahead of any other nation in their state laws that recognize the threats of CO2 and put forward a schedule for reducing CO2 emissions. That is being challenged by a ballot initiative that will be voted this autumn in California. AB 32 is the legislation. The initiative that challenges it is being supported by something in the order of, is it 85 or 87% of the support is coming from a handful of individuals or oil and gas, with individuals with oil and gas interests or oil and gas companies out of state. That money is all coming from out of state. Why? Because, well, it really is a national issue. And if they can beat it back in California, the likelihood that it would catch on and be successful in other places, as many of California is very progressive legislation relating to pollution, air quality. So you're right. Books like Merchants of Doubt are extremely important because it's a highly authoritative, scholarly effort. I was involved in that Union of Concerned Scientists report you mentioned to do some of the early work on that. When we had a press conference with the first results of that, within minutes, ExxonMobil had a big blast on their website saying, what a bunch of nonsense. And it was all completely misrepresenting their interests. And then that disappeared a couple hours later. And about 2 weeks later, they said they were no longer going to fund these highly visible merchants of doubt. They continued funding others. But you're right. Scientists are very naive about that. Scientists rarely recognize where those sorts of threats are coming from. And when we do, I think people like Naomi, historians of science, and social scientists who understand what's going on need to call the alarms.
Sheila?
So I'd like to take issue with both the premises of your question and a little bit with what Jim said. And first of all, I think what Jim said illustrates that scientists are not that naive, at least not at the highest institutional levels. And I think there's a spate of books now, not just Merchants of Doubt, but also another book called Bending Science. And anyway, and UCS, Union of Concerned Scientists. I mean, that is, it's the scientific community doing this. So I don't think that one can accuse scientists of naivete. I think one has to take a somewhat more structural look at all of this. All science gets paid for by somebody or another, whether it's government or whether it's the private sector or what have you. And our work of regulation would absolutely grind to a halt if we did not count on corporations to produce knowledge. So the basis for regulation, health and safety regulation for the most part, is stuff that we require industries to do. They are producers of knowledge, and we, of course, have to count on them doing it honestly. We don't always pay our government agencies to monitor the work that they're doing, but the point is that the principle that we as a society rely on the private sector for producing honest knowledge is deeply embedded in the American policy structure, and we would be up the creek if we didn't have private dollars as well as public dollars flowing into our research environment. And we've taken a lot of policy steps in the last 30 years to encourage closer cooperation between the private sector and the public sector and universities in producing research. So a few years ago, there was a highly controversial $500 million injection of funds from a certain two-letter oil company that has lately come into disrepute to the University of California to do work on biofuels. And lots of people on the faculty of UC Berkeley objected, and for the most part, the people who objected on ethical and public interest grounds did not succeed. And in 1980, the US government passed a law saying that there should be much closer tie-ins between government-funded research and the patents that come out of that research. So I think we cannot exonerate and excuse ourselves as a polity. The fact is that these merchants of doubt produce results that could be taken up everywhere, and yet in other countries that it doesn't have the same kind of ripple effects that it does here. So I think we have to ask ourselves what kind of polities we are and what kinds of citizens we are, how much doublespeak we engage in when we want the private sector for some things and don't want it for certain other things. And the policy question is, how do we distinguish between the good knowledge that we rely on the private sector to produce, big companies. We rely on them to produce good knowledge. DuPont produced the alternative to CFCs, as well as the CFCs themselves, but that's sort of beside the point. You know, we rely on them to do these things. So where does that reliance end and the skepticism begin? That's a huge political question, and I think that's the way we have to confront it.
I just want to add very briefly, there's a great book called Toxic Sludge is Good for You by John Stauber, and he's got another one called Trust Us, We're Experts. You know, but the notion of what Professor was talking about with the move against AB 32 in California, he's right. It's funded principally by many people who have vested interests, deep pocket vested interests in the fossil fuels. And that's one of the brothers is Bill Koch, who's the leader of the opposition against Cape Wind. Now, I'm not going to make guilt by association, but what I would say is this. Yes, there is big money on both sides now. It's no longer that environmentalists are groovy guys and gals, you know, wearing beads in a makeshift office at the top of some building. That's not happening. When you go to the climate conferences, you go and there's a sign there that says bingo. And it's big international NGOs. And they have a place at the table, and they are well-funded, and they are well-organized, and they have terrific expertise that is very deep and is very wide. And so don't think that there's an imbalance here. There isn't anymore. The environmental movement, at least in terms of the climate, certainly in the climate, has all grown up.
Let's go here.
I'm going to be a little cynical here and say I think, unfortunately, at this time we are a society of incredibly selfish individuals. And I know that sounds very cynical, and we're in Cambridge and we're among very educated people that care a lot about a lot of things, but I come from Norwood, and but I think we are an incredibly selfish society, and politicians don't win offices today by saying, we're going to help your whole community, we're going to help the school kids, we're going to help the prisoners, we're going to help all these people. The only way politicians win in this country is by saying, you lost your job, we're going to help you. This happened to you. Everybody wants a bigger car, everybody wants me, and how do you appeal, how do you convince that person that is only concerned with my income, my family, my life? How do you convince that person to change or to care about any of this stuff?
The question essentially is, in a very individualist and self-centered society, how do you create some sense of the broader good for social change? So,
If that's all we were, then I'd join you in cynicism. But I don't think that's all that America is or has been. I mean, obviously, we're looking for leaders who can energize the other part, but this is the country that has spawned the word associationism, that we do get together and band together. I think that the idea of stewardship, that has kind of died out a bit. And, you know, I think I'll let Jim speak because he's been involved in building some unconventional coalitions between scientists and people who do get people to care about things beyond themselves. I don't know if you
Yes,
want
here.
to talk about that.
If it's possible to maybe shift the discussion, I think, you know, we're in a period of tremendous hand-wringing, and I'm a journalist, and in the media, coming from mainstream media, we've been hand-wringing about the changes that are going on. We see gridlock in Washington. We have dealt with these problems, and we're seeing this denialism in lots of different areas, whether it's vaccines and autism or climate denialism. So is there a way to maybe shift from descriptive hand-wringing, woe is me, to some of the things that key players can do in terms of leadership on these issues of risk? There's a kind of common denominator of how do you assess risk, how do you manage risk, how do you communicate about risk, and it's tend to be dealt with in a linear way. The assessors are here, the managers are here, communicators are here. How is there a way, now we're seeing that it's more effective if the assessors can communicate and the managers can understand the science. So at the risk of another half hour take some of the current angst and turn it into an opportunity rather than simply describing a better event?
Well, what I have to say might tie back to the earlier question as well. First of all, I think you're correct that this is about risk assessment, and risk assessment that we might make individually or for our family or for our community, for our nation, for the human race. And risk assessment is something we do every day, all the time. You know, we decide based on what we know that if I'm going to get an automobile, I know that's dangerous, but I will be safer if I'm in an automobile that's in good condition. I'll be safer if I'm in an automobile that I attach a shoulder harness that has modern safety equipment in good condition. And some of us, remember the days when the automobile industry said, we're not going to do that stuff because people won't pay for it. We're not even going to put seat belts in, because people won't pay for it. So gradually we became conditioned to a sense that if I have a choice, I'm going to minimize my risk. And certainly, and we think we do this with insurance. So do I think my house is going to burn down? No, I don't think it's going to burn down. Now, many of us, if we have a mortgage, you don't have a choice. The mortgage company says, buy fire insurance. But even without a mortgage, I have fire insurance. I think it's a reasonable thing to do. So the fact that we do individually do this, and you mentioned public health, and Allan was talking earlier about this in the medical profession. Think of a decision that is made every day in every hospital across this country when physicians are looking at individuals who show symptoms of appendicitis. You can't be absolutely confident that is a red-hot appendix until you take it out. In fact, hospitals have a criteria which is constantly monitored to see how many normal appendixes are removed. And if you never removed a normal one, you're erring on the side of putting patients at risk for a ruptured appendix, which of course could lead to all sorts of complications, sterility in women, death, peritonitis. And so in the absence of complete knowledge, the precautionary principle is taken, that we've got enough knowledge to err on the side of caution. So if you look at where this seems to compute pretty well, interestingly, it's for some individuals a no-brainer, but in communities like cities, and even larger communities like states, you're seeing that action is being taken by mayors. There are over 1,000 cities right now in the United States where mayors have decided that on the basis of their constituents' interest in this problem, they are going to reduce their greenhouse gas emission footprint. Mayor Menino convened a task force a little over, I guess, a year and a half ago, and I was on this task force. It reported out last autumn. And he wanted to know what we can do in the city of Boston to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. What are all the things we can do, not just for the buildings owned by the city and the vehicles owned by the city, but for everything in the city, and not just everything that sits in the city, but everything that happens because people come into the city every day to use our museums and hospitals and whatever. And we worked through an analysis to see if by 2020 we could meet a goal of a 20% reduction. And when it appeared that wouldn't be all that difficult, he said, let's do better. Let's do 25. And it's a very careful, very thoughtful analysis. Focus groups all around the city. Every group that came together, and these are open to anybody who wanted to come, that's what they're talking about. Were people interested in this? Were people prepared to change their behavior in a way that would move the city? The mayor saw it as a winning issue. Every place that this was tested. And it's not just in Boston, you find that in cities, and not just in blue states, you find it in cities across the US of A. So to some degree, it's back to that scale of where the discussion works. And again, I come back to the special interest. There was very little opportunity for them to really get in the way. Very little opportunity for a person up for election in 6 months saying, where am I going to get the money for this campaign? Oh, that's handy. Here's someone who would really like me to talk to them about important campaign contribution. And if you look across the U.S. Senate, who gets the most money from oil and gas companies, it's not evenly distributed. It won't surprise you. Coal companies, it heaps heavily on the individuals who are standing up saying the science is not clear on this. So I think that we need to work where we are successful at these scales, where individuals are concerned about not just themselves, and it's interesting, you find generational shifts here, the number of people who say, I'm concerned about my grandchildren's lives. I'm concerned about decisions I'm making today that will affect their lives 20, 40 years from now, when I'm gone.
Just one comment. It seems your earlier perspective on tobacco, a lot of the movement in the anti-smoking area came from local laws initially for secondhand smoke. So
I was going to say just the same thing, that really the anti-tobacco movement started as a local grassroots movement when the Congress was completely broken in terms of any kind of regulatory initiative. Yes? No.
Congress has changed?
No, things have not changed. Let's take a question from the far end here.
Hi, I wanted to first pick up a couple of things that Professor Jasanoff mentioned about sort of the role of authority and credibility with scientists. So you mentioned very correctly that who is trusted to provide information is for many of these issues the key question, because nobody has access to reviewing, nobody's able to review all the literature themselves. And you also said that the Germans have had success with making the deliberation process sort of more joint between science and values and politics. And I wanted to ask if you thought there was any tension there, whether bringing scientists into a more political process was likely to undermine their credibility and their ability to present themselves as sort of independent, honest authorities. And generally, kind of, if you could comment on the role of how authority and credibility are created and maintained by scientists and how they're used effectively.
I'll just make sure everybody heard the question. The question centers on the authority and legitimacy of scientists and what happens to that authority when scientists enter the political sphere. And it's something Sheila has written extensively about.
Yes, so, well, to do justice to your question would take us a lot more minutes than we have. But I think one has to make a distinction between science that's being used for public ends. I mean, so public science, regulatory science, policy-relevant science, whatever you want to call it. And I think that that's really a different domain from when people are doing something closer to the ideal of ivory tower science, where they're fighting over, what is the right contrast agent to use to illuminate the functions and, the neural cells of this particular animal so that I can get the functional MRI image to look right or whatever. I mean, I think that those are kind of different orders of things. So interestingly, the German model is faulted for undermining the authority of science, mostly by American observers. But, I mean, there's actually a National Research Council study of approximately 2007 or 8, which specifically discusses a number of different assessment mechanisms and what the strong points and the weak points are. And they praise the German model for producing consensus, but they fault it for blending science and politics. But the fact is that if you want to do the translation, I mean, you can't be a good translator unless you're steeped in the medium on both sides. I mean, that is what translation is about. If you want to translate from German to English, you've kind of got to have native knowledge of both of those things to do a really good job. So I think that my own preference is to think of some of this transmission of knowledge into the public in a much more networked fashion. I mean, so off there somewhere is the ivory tower science that's mostly being done by scientists. And then at the other end, there are not just the bingos, but also the Gellermans, you know, who are doing the complicated work of getting these messages into the public domain. Somewhere in between is the particular conversation between policymakers and experts. I mean, so not scientists, but experts, which is really a different cadre of people. And there, I think, a little bit of pollution therapy that is not being so very purist about where the science ends and the politics begins is important, especially, and this is the part of the discussion we really don't have time to get into, especially because it turns out that even that ivory tower stuff is never independent of values, that there always is stuff there that's cultural and historically situated and politically grounded and so on and so forth. It just comes into the open and bursts into the open when the science becomes more policy relevant. So take the bull by the horns, and, you know, would it matter if we had a committee that people were prepared to trust in which the politicians appointed some of the experts? It'd at least get them in the same room instead of flinging Molotov cocktails from the side somewhere, and maybe we would get somewhere.
I just wanted to say one quick thing. This whole notion of science in the political process, you can see it in action at these COPs, these committees of the parties, I guess they're called conferences of the parties, which happen every year for this UN process. And you see vividly, you know, the communities, because there's thousands of people in these vast halls, and you can see very quickly these communities of people, because they look the reporters look one way, and the radio reporters look a certain way, and the international politicians look another way, the visiting dignitaries, they come in and they look a different way, and the NGOs look a different way. So you can see these, but they all come with a different culture to this process. So it's amazing to me that they even can speak to each other, you know, let alone somebody can actually report on this mess. But but again, the cultures are different fundamentally. The culture of a scientist, asking questions, observing, coming up with correlations, testing the hypothesis, that's antithetical to an international politician. They have no part of that. They don't want to know from it. So bridging that gaps and trying to unite those cultures is a tremendous task.
It does seem to me, just as an observation, that we're talking about a kind of range of skills for scientists that are very different than the idealization of the scientist in the laboratory. And now we're talking about scientists as communicators, as political activists, and a kind of very complex notion of the modern scientist who has policy-relevant findings. But Jim, you...
Well, if I could just pick up Bruce's comments. First of all, very few scientists have had any sort of training in how to communicate with the public. You know, our training is how to communicate in great detail what we know and understand about the science, and more often than not, what we're really talking about is what we don't understand. We're talking about the interesting questions, how we're going to solve them. What we know and know well is rarely something we spend a lot of time talking about. And when you find in your discussion with Bruce, and he says, okay, tell me, is this happening or isn't it? Say, well, you know, it could be happening, but let me tell you the 5 concerns I'd have about saying that, and maybe it isn't happening, and I'll give you 5 concerns about that. He said, no, I don't want to hear that. I want to hear, is it happening, yes or no? And so there's this tension, because the scientist wants to talk about whether it's a really exciting problem, what we don't know, and how we're really keen to understand that. And he says, you know, tell me what you know and what you don't know.
Right. The role of the reporter is to explain things you don't understand.
Now, when you go to these conferences of the parties, which I've never been to, there are very, very few scientists at these. The scientists have done their work beforehand. There will be various NGOs that Bruce is referring to will have a scientist or 2 in their staff, but the scientists who've generated most of that understanding are not at these big meetings. You've done your work. You've written it as clear as you can. It's now moved off into the bowels of the sausage factory. Now let me just say one other thing about this, and this is an anecdote, but it's telling. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who believe that as soon as a scientist begins to comment publicly on something of policy relevance, the scientist is now strayed from a position of representing the best understanding of the subject to that of an advocate. And as an advocate, you've got to wonder, what's their agenda? What do they really want to do? And they're going to marshal scientific evidence to support that position. And my anecdote, back to, I mean, we have an administration in Washington right now which picked from the top ranks of I'll comment on the earth sciences, and I think it's probably, we can say for the health sciences as well, of our colleagues around the country for leadership positions, the Secretary of Energy, the head of the Office of Science, Technology Policy, the head of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, the head of NIH. These, it's not always been true. Oftentimes the administration puts people in these posts in the scientific community most knowledgeable. The area says, what? I mean, even, who is that person? I'm not kidding. So here was an administration that was going to bring science into discussions and into the policy process in a way that we did not have in the early administration. Mr. Obama had this team together before the inauguration. Mr. Bush, the second, the junior, the younger, did not have a science advisor in his first administration until Halloween. It was Halloween. Along about April, May of that first year, they had approached people who had said, no, I'm not interested. And he called someone into his office, or he didn't, I'm sorry. A member of the staff, not chief of staff, called someone in, a very scientist in a very influential position, and said, well, what's the problem? Why are we not getting scientists interested in taking this post, the science advisor for the president, head of the Office of Science, Technology Policy? And this individual who told me this story said, well, look, he said, you know, you're demoting the office, you're moving out of the White House, you're going to cut the staff by 2/3. This is not a time for a scientist to really get involved in your administration. He said you should be going the other way. Scientists should be sitting in the cabinet meetings, should be helping to inform all the decision-making process about what's happening in science. And the person from the chief of staff's office was incredulous. He said, you're kidding me. He said, if you have a scientist there, you'd have to have a farmer, you'd have to have a plumber, you'd have to have all those special interest groups, because all they'd want to do is argue for more money for science. He didn't appreciate the fact that many of us believe that science is more than just a special interest group. It is providing information that we hope would be useful.
Let's take one last question here. Yes.
Why don't you talk about grandchildren? The American public is increasingly skeptical over the past 20 years. Skepticism has gone up rather than down. Something's wrong. Before they used to talk about what kind of a world are your grandchildren going to live in? And now it's how much of a deficit do your grandchildren have to cover? The corporate interests, the market fundamentalists have turned that completely around. They've turned everything completely around. And this has become such an emotional country. People are not reasonable anymore, I don't think. I think people may base their judgments on their feelings. So you have to get them in the feelings, because reason is not going to cut it with this stuff.
Well,
My dad lives in a retirement village, and you would think that the people would talk about their grandchildren. Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah. The question was how to frame the question about the future for grandchildren, and would that be an effective way of reorganizing the types of discussions that we're having about the future of scientific change?
So my father lives in a retirement village, very nice, and very smart people live there. It's a lovely community, and I'm amazed, astonished when I sit there and have dinner with his friends, and they're taking these incredible positions that act and operate in their, what I would perceive in their own best interest, their opposite. Why didn't Obama? He's been in office 2 years. How come he hasn't fixed the economy? That kind of stuff. And I'm not going to, my politics, but I'm listening to this stuff and I'm thinking, it's not an informed opinion. It's not an informed opinion, but it is informed. It's been informed by people like me. The people like me, the reporters, who are, guilty as charged, that the news cycle that's driving this thing is so fast, and it's so driven by money and driven by 1.5 line stories that encapsulate a life's work, that the reduction, the reducing that goes on turns people into morons. And I'm guilty. I'm guilty as charged. I'll give you an example. Somebody spoke very nicely about NPR. NPR stories are shorter, and NPR sound bites are far shorter. I know because I have to produce to that stuff, right? So what drives it? Well, part of it's culture and art, and you want to change your forms and all the rest of it. But a lot of it is just, we got to put a lot more on, a lot better, a lot faster, you know? And so it's driving a community of people, a nation, a society. I don't see any good coming out of this.
I hate to end this, and I know some of you still have questions, so I think that the panelists will be at the reception afterwards, and you're welcome to bring your questions to them. I do have one reflection on this, is that in a way, as we look at this larger question of the relationship of science to knowledge, to culture, to policy, one of the things that emerges from these excellent questions and the excellent presentations of our panelists is that these are studyable problems that demand more attention from all of us, both as people in a university perhaps, or as citizens, than they really have achieved. And I think, you know, it comes back to something that Jim McCarthy said. Even when science solves a problem, we're really only at the beginning of a set of very complex processes of knowledge and policy and regulation that really will influence our future in profound ways. So I think this was really an excellent discussion, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I especially want to thank our panelists for their presentations, and I want to thank Liz Werby and the museum for sponsoring this event tonight. So thank you very much.